Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm Amit Patel, filling in as guest host for Kim Kushner. Today, we are very excited to welcome to the show Dr. Jason Campagna, someone I've had the privilege of collaborating with for many years. Jason is currently serving as the Chief Medical Officer of Q32 Bio, an early-stage biotech pioneering a new approach to treatment of complement-mediated diseases. Jason has significant experience in biotech, but it comes with a background which is much less common than we typically see. He's been a licensed physician leader who's practiced in academic and clinical medicine, private practice, and held roles in hospital administration. I'm thrilled to have Jason on for many reasons today. One, to learn about his career and how he's bridged and leveraged his leadership experiences in these multiple settings to where he is now in his current role at Q32 Bio. And two, to discuss how he prioritizes and strives to cultivate a culture of safety in the organization he leads. Jason, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
My pleasure, Amit. Happy to be here.
Great. So I provided a bit of a teaser regarding your background, Jason, but to start us off, would be great if you could provide some details in your own words on your professional journey to date.
Sure, I'm happy to. As you noted, I was a previous and a prior life academic physician. So I trained as a critical care anesthesiologist, earned a PhD in neurobiology. I completed a pretty traditional academic track. Went through a postdoc, full internship, residency, and a fellowship, and ended up practicing clinical medicine in an academic center where I had a lab, again, a very traditional mix of kind of academic engagement, sometime in the lab, sometime in the operating rooms, in the ICU, and then the remainder of the time just trying to do all of the things that academics try to do. Was a board examiner, et cetera. My jump to biotechnology, I can't say that it was planned. It wasn't a grand life mission. Life just sort of took me in that direction, both combination of professional colleagues that had moved on and gone into industry over the years, and just the porous nature of what Boston and that practice environment is like, with people sort of coming and going on both sides, that ultimately, after about 15 years in clinical practice, by that point I was in private practice at a smaller hospital system in California. I made the formal jump after sort of dabbling in it for a couple of years. I made the formal jump and took a full-time role for the first time in industry.
Great background, and definitely appreciate that. So you've held many leadership roles in industry in both mid and large size publicly traded companies. Can you speak to some of the lessons you've learned from your experiences there that's really shaped your decision making in your current role at Q32 Bio and an early stage biotech company?
Yeah, great question. I think there's probably two. So size often masks the same problem, whether it's a group of two people just sitting in a room trying to work an issue, or a team of 200 on a global basis trying to solve a larger problem. Underneath of it, I think I've at least come to believe that the core elements are always sort of the same. How do we truly know if the people that we're working with understand, in the case of safety here, the issues and the concerns that we have? So people will often talk, do we believe that our trial is protecting patients adequately? Do we believe that we have the appropriate monitoring plan? Do we believe, and often you just get answers, and you get an answer, you're like, great, that's wonderful. What we often don't do is ask, well, why do you believe that? On what basis do you say you know that? So in larger companies, there's often more opportunity to catch those missteps later, because almost universally, people don't truly have a view on those things. They sort of think they do, but certainly the whole team doesn't. Smaller companies, on the other hand, you are more likely to get a candid answer and one that you can understand clearly. On the other hand, there's a lot less margin of safety, if you will, degrees of freedom on how to remedy that if something goes wrong. Organization is smaller, less people available, time cadence is often picked up. So I think sort of in summary, very similar in terms of the nature of the problems that we face, but from an organizational perspective, they mask different elements of the challenge that we're working towards when we think about patient safety in this regard.
And Jason, how do you approach talking about patient safety and maybe the culture of safety in general, especially for smaller biotech companies More established big pharma, they already have multiple products in the market, and their view of safety is slightly different. They don't have to worry about the funding every stage, every quarter of the year. But for smaller startups, biotech companies that maybe they're not quite there yet, they don't have their product in the market. They may be even still in preclinical or maybe phase one. When do you start thinking about that culture of safety? When do you think about building your PV and drug safety organization? What's the sequential thinking there?
It's a great question. I will say that for me, I do it from day one. And how do I do it? I don't know that I have a recipe, but I certainly have an approach. And I try, I think storytelling is a really powerful motif in business. I don't know that we do enough of it as people. We all have lives and friends and families and things where we tell stories all the time. Moment you get into work, we sort of get very linear and focused on the details, but often a story will capture everything. And here's one, for example, that I've told many of my teams. Mercury space capsule program, United States. I think everybody's somewhat familiar with elements of it. But in 1961, Gus Grissom, really one of the earliest astronauts in the Mercury program, his Mercury capsule sunk after it landed in the Pacific Ocean as a consequence of these explosive bolts that were on the hatch of his spacecraft. A lot of debate over what actually happened, but what we do know that happened is that the explosive bolts were triggered, the hatch opened, the capsule was not secure, water rushed into the capsule was lost. Two things are absolutely clear, though. First, without that explosive bolts on that hatch, the hatch would not have been open. And therefore, second, the capsule would not have sunk. But everyone at NASA didn't put the hatch in place to try to sink the capsule. It was there for a safety reason. And in the case of Gus Grissom, it was there to make it more likely that in the case of an accident, that the commander of that ship, Gus Grissom, would be able to exit the capsule safely and rapidly. Therein lay, I think, a powerful story that, depending on how we want it to go, there are many aspects of that are applicable to companies. Example, often the things we put in place that we think are supportive of safety have a way of actually making the situation less safe. Anti-lock brakes are another good example. Put them on cars, what happens? People go faster. And then it tends to offset some of the risk mitigation that anti-lock brakes were trying to do. So what I attempt to do when I engage organizations, particularly in smaller companies, has been to find what those stories are that spark interest in the organization and rally people around them and use that as a sort of jumping off point or a springboard for various lessons that are relevant to the clinical programs in a pharmaceutical company.
What challenges do you come across dealing with that, Jason, as you go through that process? What are some of the couple of the challenges that we can all learn from, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, it ranges from, maybe I'll frame it this way. The nature of the challenges range from the individuals not believing that they have a role to play in safety. They'll answer like, well, it has everything to do with the system. What role do I have in keeping a patient or a clinical trial safe? To the other extreme, which is, it's not my problem. It's the sort of the concern of the vendor or the CRO or the medical monitor, whoever it may be. And between those two extremes, I think almost anything has come up. And how do we engage them? I'll go back to the story nature of it all. I will really try to rally people around concrete examples of ways in which individuals make an enormous difference when it comes to subject protection. What I say to people all the time is that safety doesn't live outside of you. It's not a yellow ribbon that you wear in hospitals that say it's Patient Safety Week. It's not a sign in your office that says this is Patient Safety Month.
Safety is part of who you are, right?
Exactly. Right. It's a consequence of how we approach our work on a day-to-day and hour-to-hour basis, and it's by definition therefore an emergent property of who we are and how we engage with our work. I think that when people truly understand that, at least they acknowledge that they have an opportunity to contribute to the dialogue around what makes safety and what doesn't. But if you can't get them over that hump, it's always this kind of external thing that often they don't believe is under any real control.
Yeah, it sounds like the goal or the output is patient safety, right? So what are some of the inputs that get us there to achieve that, Jason? Like, what are your thoughts around that?
So how do we do better, right? So this is the eternal dilemma that we face. So in the 1980s, there was a really interesting Yale psychologist named Scott Perrow. He wrote a book, not top seller list on Amazon, that's for sure, but it's a widely influential book in the field of safety and risk called Normal Accidents. And Perrow didn't mean normal in terms of description of frequency. He meant normal in description of how they unfold. A good example is we die only once, but we all do it. It's simply known to occur. That's a normal event. When one can look at a safety scenario and simply note that however uncommon it may be, his book illuminated that the path to get there is actually almost identical in any major safety event that occurs. And he hits on a kind of, I would say, a couple of really critical elements there, but here's just a few of them. Example, it's often the most banal and trivial things that lead to major safety events. We tend to think of them as these big, well, what happened? And we're waiting for the sky fell and this happened. That's actually often not what happens at all. It's something very minor. The patient didn't exactly recall that they were supposed to stop their medication at this. And when they called, the person who got them on the phone was a little rushed and they didn't quite hear the full sentence. And the next thing you know, these banal and trivial events all added up to go boom, major consequence. I think another example, which was a critical one that I learned from Perrow, is that organizations in their zeal to do better, often in their attempts to do so by layering on more organizational complexity, they contribute to making the problem worse and not better. The Gus Grissom capsule example is a perfectly good one there. Very bunch of well-meaning engineers thought it would be better to add explosive bolts to a hatch, and it turned out to be much, much, much worse from the perspective of the capsule, and therein lay the rub. Organizations in their zeal to do better often make things go worse. And the last point is, from an organization perspective, and this is where bigger is often more problematic than smaller. But what are the kinds of missteps that bigger organizations take? Well, it's things like, I'll sort of in quotes, time and again, organizational missteps were overlooked, small corners cut, not paid attention to, small issues not addressed. And then you look up and then how did a safety event happen? Slowly at first and then suddenly. It sort of accrued, all of that sediment accrued. I think that those lessons from Perrow are very real and they are really relevant to organizational structure and how we think about a culture of safety.
Yeah, and I'm not making a blanket statement by any means, but it sounds like in many organizations, safety becomes deprioritized, right? It's at times becomes reactive versus proactive, and it's a cost center until something goes wrong. Like, what's your perspective on that? What's your thoughts on that? I know we've collaborated in the past and we've seen that in real time, but we'd love for you to share that with some.
Yeah, I think it's insightful and sadly it's true. And I think it manifests in a couple of ways, but a common one is, well, come on, we've paid X amount of dollars for safety initiatives over the last X number of years. That should be sufficient, right? Well, aren't we good? Aren't we covered? Well, maybe. Safety is not bankable, though. You could be safe for a week, a month, a year, a decade, and the next day you can be dramatically unsafe and have a catastrophic outcome. You don't get any credit for not having been safe for the prior period of time. So that, in a way, those sunk dollars don't matter. It's irrelevant. And I think the second way in which they do it is that those initiatives, often intended to facilitate safety, the organization will tend to say, oh, well, we have these initiatives in place. We can therefore go faster, do more, take on more risk because we've sort of covered ourselves with those safety initiatives. A really common example in operating rooms is production pressure. How quickly should we move between cases? How quickly should we exit people from operating rooms, bring them to recovery rooms, start the next case? There's an economic side to that argument. And then there's fundamentally, when are people safe enough to be woken up from an anesthetic and exited from the care of a one-on-one provider, whether it's a nurse or a physician? When the moment you put initiatives in place to accelerate that with emphasis, organizations like hospitals will tend to take advantage of it and move faster. No different than the average person who, when they got anti-lock brakes, initially they drove more safely, and now we know that no one drives better with anti-lock brakes. In fact, our driving behavior is much worse. in a world with all of our safety devices in the cars, people have taken on enormous risk compared to the way we drove in the 1990s. And I think that's what happens in organizations. They sort of overcome their goals to be safer by increasing activities and actions, which in and of themselves tend to make you less safe.
Right. I think that's why, that's why the culture of safety that you've been thinking about and bringing up is so critical, that, thinking about safety, not just as a department, but it's something that we're all kind of responsible for, because we all have different perspective and we may see different aspect of things that even the folks within that function or that organization may not see, especially with a lot of the people from the clinical development side, clinical operations, our partners, our CROs, our solution providers, our thought partners, medical affairs, our MSL team, right? It's almost like a really a team approach to that safety, as opposed to, well, that's not really my job, I don't have to worry about it, I'm sure they have it covered. One question building up on what you were just talking about was, and the cost center that Amit was bringing up. Some people do have the view that is a cost center and is a very transactional. It's a kind of like a necessary evil that we have to have. And I've seen in organizations, with my own experience, that the PV and drug safety was really a strategic partner cross-functionally, and being more proactive. They were not just sitting in the office and for a drug, adverse event to happen, and then do their investigations and do the forms and do the reporting as requested. They were actually being more proactive. They were trying to look for signals, to making sure that the product continues staying in the market, because with those signals there are certain actions you can take. You can focus on education. You can focus on papers, posters, manuscripts that you can have to make sure that the clinicians are appropriately kind of knowledgeable and have the education to make the right decisions. What is your view about PV and safety as a strategic partner, which may not be today in many companies, and it is in a lot of companies too, I'm sure.
Clive Meanwell was the founder of the Medicines Company, and I worked for Clive. He was my first entry into the world of pharma. So Clive brought me out of medicine into the Medicines Company, and the very first place where he had me, I did sort of an internship with the Medicines Company, like a translational year. He would put me in every function in the company for anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. So it went from I was frontline with commercial teams embedded in sales teams, all the way down to quality teams doing a site audit. The first place he put me was drug safety. And I think that he viewed, and I'll quote him back, Chapter 1 of any business plan should be the opportunity. Chapter 2 should be your PSUR, for example. That unless you have a clear eye towards how the product has performed in the real world, data, safety, including down to when we would have sales events where you would have a plan of action event with the sales teams, he would comb through the PSURs for case narratives that he wanted to share with the salespeople, so that they understand how their drug goes wrong, that they were selling in the real world. I think Clive was the model for me in how safety and PV is, by definition, a strategic asset to a company. That being said, I think it's an anomaly, unfortunately. I think, Raman, what you just outlined, teams that are consistently able to do that over long periods of time in a cross-functional manner, I think that's rare. Outside of healthcare, outside of pharma, we call those kinds of organizations high reliability organizations, or HROs. This is, again, another field of study. And the characteristics of those fields are that where it's an environment, one, characterized by high risk, uncharacteristically high risk. Healthcare is a good example. Pharmaceutical clinical trials, in particularly the more severe the indications, the more that holds true. The second is where the systems surrounding those organizational structures are complex. Complex meaning we don't truly understand all of the inputs and the outputs, and even if we did, we couldn't control them anyway. And the third are long periods of time of high operational cadence and tempo. That's clearly medicine, operating rooms, and certainly when we run clinical trials at speed. When you have an organization that are confronted with those three elements, the majority of them, the ones we're all familiar with, don't do as well as we would like. They're the ones that end up making whatever relevant publication that we're all reading about. Ooh, that's painful. But the ones that do it well in the way that you described, that over time consistently maintain that, they get this nice label called an HRO. And there are some really nice examples of those in healthcare systems and pharmaceutical companies. The US Navy is a very good example. Carrier flight operations are one. But it takes intent and it takes leadership to do that. And back to the investment in safety. If companies already believe that safety is a line item that's really sunk cost and there's no value, it's very difficult to get them to come around to, well, I need to pay a thoughtful leader to help my company get around this organizational construct. So instead, we just sort of limp along from one event to the other and never really grow from it.
All right. No, absolutely agree. I think it's a mindset. The mindset should be, how do I use PV and safety as a strategic pillar, as a strategic driver for the overall company, which also brings the safety that the clinicians and the patients wants as well, as opposed to this is the department there that is collecting side effects, and that's not necessarily something that we want to deal with. On the other hand, I've seen companies, as you were just describing, that they actually want to study those side effects. They want to generate more data around it. They want to know why they are seeing this certain adverse event. They're looking for the answer. And as you know, sometimes in science, there's no black and white and there's no answers, and there's just more data and more data. And based on the data that is being generated, I think the clinicians also feel a little bit safer to use the product in a certain situation that they might not have if the company was not really investing to get kind of the core of the issue of the safety.
Yeah, I think that when you really click into this, it's really a rich area to explore. But some challenges that teams like that have, and I mean, what's the goal of all of this, right? In an ideal world, everything we know as a sponsor in the pharmaceutical industry is known by our investigators or our treaters real time, instantaneously, with no filters. And second, that we are fully aware of the safety profile of our product at any given moment in time. We're sort of information rich and inference poor. We don't need to infer anything. The facts are sort of right in front of us. What happens in the real world? Two things go wrong all the time. The first is it's really difficult for teams to constantly work when nothing's going wrong. This is very typical in what happens in hospitals. That's why you say, well, we were safe all last year, and we didn't have one event. What do you expect from us? For teams, what's their goal every day? Are you counting on the wall event-free days? Who does that, right? Adverse event-free enrollments? No one does that, although it would be a powerful metric. What if the goal was to go 900 days in a row without a safety event? Sure, people would game the system, but in a pure world, that's a really thoughtful metric to think about. The other problem that we get into when teams are out there and we're talking about how do we take advantage of data and engage and everything else, it's when you're in front of the problem, you never really know how extremely difficult it's going to be. And if a sponsor reacts to every safety event as if it could be a death, well, that will quickly end, right? Meaning the sponsor will run out of gas, run out of steam, run out of money. Something will exhaust themselves. But almost every one of the major events that happen always start with, I never saw that coming.
Right.
Back to the banal of it all, right? The banality of it all. You get a note across the transom, oh, we had an adverse event at site A and patient 1. And you talk to the investigator and it doesn't seem like anything. And then a week later, it's an expedited safety report. What happened? I think it's really difficult to build teams that are able to weather that sort of rapid escalation from very banal circumstances and at the same time maintain a high level of vigilance week after week, month after month when nothing is happening. I think it's very difficult to do that. And one of the things that I try to instill in the teams is that periodically you have to challenge them with, in a way, like a fake safety event. You have to have a drill. This is what the Navy has taught us. You know what they do on nuclear submarines? I don't know, but they don't launch nuclear missiles. That's for sure. So they do a lot of training and they do a lot of drilling. And that is a lesson that I have tried to bring in, whether it's in medicine or in sponsors, to even basics of, hey, you see that AED on the wall? Has anybody practiced with that lately? And similarly, we've never had, take my company at Q32, we've been very fortunate in our clinical development programs. We've not had a reason to have an expedited safety event. That's wonderful. But on the other hand, we haven't practiced it either. So what would happen if? And I think that that's the kind of organizational challenge that you're facing in a world in which, when in the absence of event, how much do you practice? How much do you rehearse? How much do you plan? Versus when you're in the thick of it and everything's sort of falling away and you have a number of safety events, how do you be something more than just reactionary to those things and yet go to a higher level? I think these are all very difficult challenges, and the smaller the company, the worse it is.
Yeah, you raise a good point, Jason, right? So a lot of the challenges that you just mentioned come down to, it's all obviously top down from the leadership perspective, but it also comes down from a budget aspect as well, right? So you're going to need the right people, the right team, the right systems in place to do a lot of that monitoring, right? So how do you approach the mail on questions such as the optimal balance of staffing and organization to meet that culture and to instill and to basically come out on the other end with that culture of safety?
I think, Amit, my approach is a little unorthodox. But I don't think it'll be surprising. It'll be unorthodox for the pharmaceutical industry. It's just a carryover from medicine that I found that the most effective way to engage people around how much do we do, an operating room team versus others, outsourcing, the hospital, the health system, everyone else, is human beings before human doings. I always ask, and I open with a team. What do you believe we need to ensure to maximize subject protection in our clinical programs? It's a very basic question, but it's a human question. It amazes me every time I ask it, the answers I get. Everyone is worried about this. Everyone. They all have an answer to that question. And it often has nothing to do with medical monitoring or reviewing safety labs or signal evaluation and risk management, SERM. It comes down to some degree of, well, who is the person doing the medical monitoring? Do I trust them? Can I believe them? Have we met the investigator, the people or the CRA that are reviewing the data? Notice they're not asking for a CRA or for an investigator. They simply want to know who they are. There's a humanity to all of this. And do we trust those people to tell us that everything's okay or everything's not okay? So back to the in versus out problem. The most critical question I ask is, once a team tells me what they need, is the vendors I engage in, are you able to bring to us that level of intimacy around patient safety? Because it's a human endeavor. It's not an abstract concept. We're not just trying to enroll numbers in a clinical trial here. We're asking, hey, Amit, in the case of, and we've worked together for many years now, who are the people that are in front of our trials? What are the nature of their training? How reliable are they? Can we meet with them? Can we talk to them? Can they meet the teams? Do the investigators like them? I know those are soft, and often people would say, who cares? If they have a degree and they're able to do the work, people would say, and they're not very expensive, that's wonderful. My approach is the exact opposite from that. I am eager to get support from the outside, but beginning with the very human elements of who those people are that are supporting us. And from there, all of the details around, great. You all can handle individual case reporting or aggregated case reporting. That gets easy to do after that. But if you don't get the first part done, I think we end up debating those line items on an SOW of who does what, never really getting to the marrow of it. Do you share our sensibilities? And more importantly, do we believe that the guidance and the safety support you're going to give us will ensure what we're trying to accomplish, which is maximizing subject protection?
Right. So you don't have to second guess it. It seems to me like the mindset that you come from is you want to integrate with your partners and with your vendors, right? Be very transparent with them so they know what the expectations are from you, how you operate, how your team operates. So they know exactly, not only just they know what they're getting into, but also they become more part of your team as an extension of your team, as opposed to this outside agency that is helping with some work that you don't have the capacity to work with. I think that allows you, and that's a very smart way of thinking about it, because I think that allows you to really tap into their to their experience and their knowledge that they have, right? When people feel like they belong somewhere and they feel like they're part of this team, as opposed to I'm this outside agency doing some of the work that they need to do, I think people just naturally step up at a different level than they would if it's something that they're more separated from.
I think this is exactly right. And this is such a critical point. It's worth just kind of re-emphasizing it. People often think of doctors, or in this case, safety physicians, as sort of knowledge engines, Wikipedia engines. I know, I'll go to my medical monitor or my safety person for a fact-based answer. That's actually not what why any of us go to physicians at all. We go there because we want their opinion. That is their judgment. And judgment comes from deep experience, pattern recognition, et cetera. So what we all do as even just lay people is we rely on our physicians and their judgment to help us steer clear of unnecessary risk. It's my view, that's identical to what I want in a vendor when we talk about safety management. Yes, I might need you to file an aggregate case report. Fine, I'm happy to pay for that. What I really care about is at the earliest moments of an event, before it's a safety issue, at the earliest moments are, tell me what you think. How does this strike you? What's your perception of this? That judgment issue that, from my perspective, is the most valuable thing that we can buy in the marketplace from people that live in a world of pharmacovigilance and that pattern recognition. Jason, it's simple as this. Got a call from our safety person, which you all, as you know, Amit, we've been working with for many years. I think the world of this team. I got a phone call a number of months ago about an event in our trial. It's a factual event. A patient presented and the following lab was observed. Great. The most important question I asked, what do you think? That's worth every dollar that we pay, having somebody on the other end of that listening to that question that's able to answer it intelligently.
And what do you think is the profile of someone who is interested, Jason, to maybe not just PV and drug safety, but overall? But since we're focusing on PV and safety, what's the profile of somebody that would be successful or they enjoy this type of work? What do you look for?
Well, there's definitely a phenotype. This you see it obviously in healthcare and you see it in industry. Certain people tend to gravitate towards these fields, but I find that quality, patient safety, regulatory all have similar traits and that they matter. But the three that I think of is that people are detail-oriented. They're reluctant to assume anything unless it's absolutely required to do so. They seek to sort of even if they do assume, they seek to validate that assumption prior to acting on it. And then lastly, that when they are engaged in activity, they're often mindful that of the individual action we're taking, back to those bolts on that explosive hatch, that others may view that act or that safety intervention from a different perspective, which may have its own challenges or problems associated with it. And let me give an example on that last point. Operating room, a magnetic resonance imaging facility. These are big magnets. There's no metal allowed, no magnetic metals allowed. There are signs everywhere. There are symbols on the floor, circles. You couldn't believe the number of warnings and precautions around making it clear that there should be no metal here, right down to the kinds of equipment that are allowed anywhere near those rooms. And that's great. Now, suddenly you're in an event and you decide that you're very worried about the child, for example, and you ask, you're mindful of this. My point is you have to be mindful of the way your decisions in safety potentially could impact other people. It's a trait that you're willing to think carefully about the potential impact that you didn't foresee. So you ask somebody, you know what, please wheel the code cart closer and just keep it outside just in case. And the next thing you know, that code cart's flying across the room because it's being taken by the magnet. And it causes an event. So everything was perfect up until that moment. And you forgot to recall or keep in mind that your action in the pursuit of safety may actually compromise safety. And I think that I'm not just trying to belabor the point for It's not trivial at all. In clinical trials, there's always a trade-off to be made. Always a trade-off to be made. You can't bring somebody in for their month 18 visit and you want safety labs, so you'll get them at home. Well, what's the consequence of getting them at home? You lose a provider's eyes on the patient. That may be okay. It may not be okay. But you must ask the question, is it acceptable if a clinical provider does not see the subject at that month 18 visit, even though I get the data? So the question is, what are we solving for? The subject laying eyes on the patient and hands, or are we solving for the data? We often will put a thing in place like a visiting nurse without regard to which of the two we're working for.
So great, Jason. So I guess one last thing, I'd love to for you to provide some type of guidance or advice for others that are in a similar situation to you, that are relatively new to industry, relatively new to playing a role such as yours, that you could provide some advice or guidance to in regards to how you would build this internally at an organization. We'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
I think chief medical officers, the title of chief medical officer often conjures up a number of things to people, and they are sort of what they are. My perspective is that the role for anyone looking to come in the industry, potentially looking to lead large organizations or small ones, and a role like a chief medical officer, I think the primary message that I would convey is that someone has to be willing to stand on principles and values that are often lost in business planning documents and strategic decision-making scenarios and long-range planning exercises and the like. We tend to get anchored on facts and figures and numbers and revenue projections and trial metrics. And somewhere someone in the organization has to be able to and willing to remind people at a team level with a simple question of, have we hurt anyone today? Have we caused any harm today? Have you thought about your actions and whether or not you're contributing to making things better or making things worse? If people are not willing to do that, or that's not interesting to them, that's okay. It doesn't make them bad people, and it doesn't mean they can't go in the industry. I would say that from my perspective, the field needs more of that. And that I think particularly now, as we're seeing a number of programs, due to the economic headwinds, closing down due to, trial miscalculations in some cases. But there's been, in my view, a rush to get a lot of programs into clinical testing because that's where the valuation has been for people. And in smaller companies, that haste to get into clinical testing as quickly as possible, layering on safety programs and medical monitoring programs. If there's no one really advocating for why you're doing it, what's the point of it all? Why are you spending the money in the first place? Someone has to be standing in the room and go, I care. This is important to me. And if a CMO is willing to do that, I think that's excellent. If a head of clinical development or operations is willing to do that, I think that's outstanding. Anyone in the organization can do it. But the higher up you go on the leadership ladder, I think the more important it is to be willing to raise your hand and say, this is important to me personally. And I also believe it's the right thing to do for this company. And if you're willing to do that, often my view is that wonderful things are given back to the organization when people take that position. Very different than the traditional advice of, study hard, work hard, run clinical trials, lean, save people money. It's, that's what I mean by unorthodox.
Right. No, that's really great advice. And as you said, I've seen in my career that people don't necessarily, especially with all of our backgrounds, people don't necessarily choose going to medical or pharmacy or any type of a research to go into the industry necessarily, right? And we all kind of end up wherever our career kind of takes us. But what you're saying is absolutely correct. It does take a certain kind of phenotype to be able to raise the hand up and say, by the way, I do care about this, and I think this is important, and this is why this is important, and this is how. Part of the challenge also is when you raise your hand up, also having a solution with it as well, right? Or at least start thinking about a solution, not necessarily a showstopper. And I think that's a critical phenotype to have for sure.
One of the things I try to convey to my teams and to myself, remind myself all the time, back to the safety is not outside of us, it's in us. The moment I hear from a team, oh, vendor A, whomever it will be, Syneos, PPD, it doesn't matter. Well, they're managing safety for us, or SSI, whomever it will be, they're managing safety. That there's no sentence that will get me more riled up more quickly than that statement. So we're going in for a regulatory interaction. We'll be like, oh, FDA may want to see X or may want to see Y. Fair. I often come back with almost the identical question every time. What's important to you? What safety data do you need to know before you would be comfortable dosing that patient? Forget what FDA thinks, because if you don't have an answer to that, what are you going to tell them? If your goal is just to tell them what you think they want to hear, that's a recipe for disaster across the board.
Right.
You have to have a personal belief, of strongly held conviction, if nothing else, about what is your view of what constitutes right and wrong here, appropriate, inappropriate, risky, not risky. And you have to be willing to stand behind that with a plan of action about what you're going to do. And this, we tend to focus on all these things with clinical holds, and everybody's all focused on, oh, what do we need to do for clinical hold? Well, if everybody had that attitude before,
yes,
you might not have clinical holds that much.
Right. And I've seen a lot of the companies, and especially even a small startup biotech company, that they're incredibly good at understanding what is the safety that the clinician is going to have or the patient is going to have, right? While they're still in preclinical and they haven't even started the clinical phase 1 yet. So they have a pretty good idea what are some of the issues that they need to be watching out for and have a concern about before even the first patient, the first human in phase 1, actually, volunteers get the product, get the drug as well. And that works out really, really nicely because you're continuously providing that insight and feedback into your program, making sure that you are collecting the right data, that whether your product is safe or not safe, that's kind of like irrelevant. You just have to make sure that you collect the right data that is ultimately beneficial for the clinician and the patient make the right decision. That's what that job is. And that all makes sense. This has been very insightful session. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. I know I've learned quite a bit. And thank you very much for your time joining us for this episode.
Well, you're welcome. I appreciated the dialogue, and thank you for inviting me.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.